In 2008, in a quiet neighborhood of Memphis, Tennessee, Carter Williams and his wife, Nicole, lived what seemed like an ordinary life. Carter, a 35-year-old truck driver, spent most of his days on the road, ensuring his family had everything they needed. Nicole, 32, stayed home with their two children, 7-year-old James and 5-year-old Lauren. Their marriage, built over 10 years, had seen its ups and downs, but for the most part, they had settled into a routine that felt stable. Carter had fallen for Nicole the moment he met her. They had crossed paths at a community event in downtown Memphis over a decade ago. She had been volunteering at a local shelter, her radiant smile lighting up the room as she helped distribute meals. Carter had been drawn to her kindness, to the warmth in her eyes that made the world feel a little softer. He had spent months trying to win her over, showing up with flowers, finding excuses to see her, calling just to hear her voice. Nicole had been cautious, hesitant to open her heart too quickly, but Carter had been patient, proving to her time and time again that he was serious about building a future together. Their early years together had not been easy. Nicole had struggled with health issues that made it difficult for her to conceive. Doctors had told her that having children might not be possible, and for a while, the weight of that reality had been unbearable. Carter had held her through nights of quiet tears, reassuring her that they would be enough for each other no matter what happened. Then, against all odds, she had become pregnant with James. It had felt like a miracle, a gift they never thought they would have. When Lauren arrived 2 years later, their family felt complete. Lately, however, something had shifted. Nicole had become distant, her usual warmth replaced by an odd detachment. She no longer greeted Carter at the door with a smile when he returned from a long day of work. Instead, she barely looked up from whatever she was doing, offering only a brief acknowledgement before returning to her task. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion or the natural ebb and flow of a long-term marriage, but the feeling that something was off lingered in his mind. Nicole had started spending more and more time at the Johnsons' house. Chris and Tasha Johnson were their longtime neighbors and close friends, living just 2 doors down. The two families had always shared a close bond, hosting barbecues, celebrating holidays together, and watching their children grow up side by side. Chris, a charismatic and outgoing man, worked as an electrician, often helping Carter with repairs around the house. His wife, Tasha, was a kind and ambitious woman who worked in corporate finance, frequently traveling for business. Because of her job, Chris was often home alone with their kids, making it natural for Nicole to step in and lend a hand when needed. At first, Carter thought nothing of Nicole's increased visits to the Johnsons. She had always been friendly with them, and with Tasha traveling so frequently, it made sense that she would want to help out. But soon, he began noticing little things that didn't sit right with him. Her visits became more frequent, lasting hours at a time. When Carter asked about her day, she gave vague answers, brushing off his questions with a distracted air. She started carrying her phone everywhere, something she had never done before. Even while folding laundry or cooking dinner, her phone was always within reach, and she was quick to turn the screen away when he walked into the room. The changes were subtle, but they built up over time, forming a pattern that Carter couldn't ignore. She laughed a little too hard at Chris Johnson's jokes when they all gathered for neighborhood events. When Carter mentioned Chris in passing, Nicole's expression would change just slightly, her smile would falter for a second before she quickly recovered, as if catching herself. She had also stopped confiding in him. Nicole used to talk about everything, her frustrations with the kids, the funny thing the cashier at the grocery store said, her random thoughts about life. But now, she seemed guarded, as if she was carrying a secret she couldn't share. Carter didn't want to be the jealous, paranoid husband. He had always trusted Nicole, and he wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation for her behavior. Maybe she was just restless from being home all the time. Maybe she needed a break, some adult conversation. But deep down, he felt the unsettling grip of doubt. He started paying closer attention. The way she got dressed before heading to the Johnsons' house, taking just a little longer to fix her hair, choosing outfits that flattered her figure rather than the comfortable loungewear she used to wear at home. The way she sometimes seemed lost in thought, unaware of his presence even when they were in the same room. Carter pulled into the driveway, his muscles aching from a long day on the road. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was earlier than usual. A delivery had been canceled at the last minute, allowing him to finish his route ahead of schedule. Normally, Nicole and the kids would be in the middle of their evening routine. He expected to hear James and Lauren running around, their laughter filling the house, and Nicole in the kitchen preparing dinner. Instead, as he stepped through the front door, silence greeted him. He hesitated for a moment, listening. Nothing. No distant chatter, no clinking of dishes, not even the hum of the television. The house felt strangely abandoned. His brow furrowed as he stepped further inside, his boots thudding softly against the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, the air carried the faint scent of food, but something was off. On the dining table, a half-eaten plate of spaghetti sat untouched, the fork resting on the edge as if someone had been interrupted mid-meal. A glass of water, still half full, stood next to it. A few crumbs were scattered across the tablecloth, and a napkin lay crumpled beside the plate. His stomach tightened. Nicole never left food sitting out like this. She was meticulous about cleaning up, especially with the kids around. It looked like they had left in a hurry, as if something had pulled them away unexpectedly. He moved through the house, calling for Nicole. No answer. He checked the kids' rooms, empty. Their toys were scattered across the floor, their beds unmade. James's sneakers were missing from the doorway, but Lauren's stuffed rabbit still sat on her pillow, untouched. Stepping outside onto the back porch, he scanned the yard. The swing set stood still, the slide empty. No sign of them. He felt a growing unease settle into his chest. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he dialed Nicole's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, no answer. He tried again. Voicemail. His grip on the phone tightened. He called James's little flip phone, the one he had given his son for emergencies. Nothing. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe they had gone for a walk. Maybe Nicole had taken them out for ice cream. But if that were the case, why hadn't she answered? Then the thought struck him. The neighbors. Nicole had been spending an unusual amount of time at the Johnsons' house lately. More than ever before. It was the only place that made sense. He quickly scrolled through his contacts and dialed Chris Johnson's number. The phone rang, but no one picked up. He tried again. Still nothing. A wave of unease washed over him. Something wasn't right. He then called Chris's wife, Tasha. After a few rings, she answered, sounding surprised to hear from him. When he asked if she was home, she paused before explaining that she was out of town on a work trip. She wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Carter exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. If Tasha wasn't home, maybe Nicole had gone over to help Chris with the kids and lost track of time. It made sense. Chris had 2 boys, and it wouldn't be the first time Nicole lent a hand when things got hectic. Maybe she had planned to stay for just a little while, and the evening had slipped away from her. Reassuring himself, he decided to walk over and get her. He grabbed his keys but hesitated before locking the door. Something still felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the unanswered calls, or maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Either way, he needed to see for himself. His pace quickened as he made his way down the sidewalk. The evening air was warm and thick, the sound of cicadas humming in the distance. The Johnsons' house loomed ahead, its porch light glowing faintly against the dimming sky. As he approached, he saw no movement inside. The curtains were drawn, and the windows darkened, as if the house was asleep. As he stepped up onto the porch, a tight knot formed in his stomach. He didn't know what he was about to find, but something told him it wouldn't be good. Carter stepped onto the porch of the Johnsons' house, his pulse quickening. The front door was slightly ajar, a faint yellow glow spilling out onto the wooden steps. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, his stomach twisting with unease. Something about the way the house stood in the dim evening light sent a ripple of dread through him. This was a place he had visited countless times before, a home where laughter had once felt warm and familiar. Now, it felt foreign, like a space he no longer recognized. Inside, the house was filled with the sounds of children's laughter. James and Lauren sat on the carpeted floor of the living room, stacking colorful blocks with the Johnson's son. They were completely absorbed in their play, unaware of his presence. The moment they noticed him, their eyes lit up with excitement. "Daddy!" James shouted, scrambling to his feet. Lauren followed, her small arms outstretched as she ran toward him. Carter barely had time to brace himself before they crashed into him, their little bodies pressing against his as they held on tight. He dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around them, inhaling their familiar scent of soap and childhood innocence. For a fleeting moment, the tension in his chest eased. The warmth of their embrace, their giggles, the way Lauren pressed her cheek against his shoulder, it reminded him of why he worked so hard, why he endured the long hours and the exhausting days. He held onto them for as long as he could, rubbing James's back and pressing a kiss into Lauren's curls. "I missed you both," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Lauren pulled back just enough to beam at him. "We were playing. Mommy said we could stay up late tonight." Carter forced a smile, ruffling her hair. "Did she?" he asked, glancing toward the hallway. Something was off. Nicole should have been here, greeting him, explaining why she hadn't answered his calls. But she wasn't. His eyes moved to the kitchen. Empty. The dining table was cluttered with used plates, a few half-empty glasses, and a nearly finished bottle of wine. A vague sense of unease settled deeper into his chest. The remnants of an evening he had not been a part of lay before him, shared food, whispered conversations, moments he had been excluded from. He called Nicole's name, but the only response was the continued laughter of the children. Something was wrong. His feet carried him down the hallway before he even realized he was moving. The familiarity of the house felt suffocating. He checked the bathroom first. Empty. The laundry room, silent. He turned the corner and found the door to the master bedroom slightly open. The air inside was still, heavy. Then, he heard it, soft laughter, a murmur of voices, hushed as if sharing something intimate. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, his heartbeat a dull, thunderous roar in his ears. Through the gap in the door, he saw movement. A flicker of motion, shadows shifting against the dim light of the bedside lamp. The room was wrapped in a golden glow, casting long, dark shapes across the walls. He pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Nicole was there. Her bare shoulders glistened in the dim light, the straps of her dress slipping down her arms. Her hair was tousled, her face tilted upward toward Chris, lips parted as she whispered something that Carter couldn't hear. Chris's hands traced slowly down her back, fingertips brushing the exposed skin. The sheets on the bed were slightly disheveled, as if they had just risen from them. The air smelled faintly of perfume and sweat, mingling into something undeniable. Carter felt the air leave his lungs. His mind refused to accept what his eyes saw. Nicole's hands were on Chris's chest, fingers curling against the fabric of his shirt, her body pressed against his. The way they moved together, the way their breaths intermingled, it was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accident. It was betrayal, raw and undeniable. For a moment, time froze. Carter couldn't move, couldn't speak. His entire world had just shifted, collapsing in on itself in a matter of seconds. The woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, was standing in another man's arms. Not a stranger. Not some faceless affair. Their neighbor. The man whose house he had entered dozens of times, whose family they had shared meals with. Rage flooded his veins, hot and blinding. His hands clenched into fists, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and the world around him blurred. He felt the heat rising from his chest to his throat, his vision narrowing as if the edges of his world were turning to ash. Then, without thinking, he stepped forward. Carter's vision blurred with rage as the scene before him burned into his mind. Every rational thought, every ounce of restraint he had ever learned was drowned beneath the fire surging through his veins. His breath came in ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His entire world, everything he had built, had just crumbled in an instant, and all he could see was the man standing too close to his wife. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, shoving the door wide open with a force that sent it slamming against the wall. The sharp noise cut through the air like a gunshot. Nicole flinched, stumbling backward, her face twisting in shock and fear. Her hands shot up instinctively, fingers trembling, her body recoiling as if she could shield herself from the storm that had just erupted in the room. Chris whipped around, eyes wide with alarm, his body tensing, but there was no time for words. Carter was already upon him. His hands closed around Chris's collar, yanking him forward with a violent force that sent them both staggering. The sound of fabric ripping filled the air as Chris struggled against his grip, his hands grasping at Carter's wrists in a desperate attempt to break free. The room spun with movement, shadows flickering wildly against the walls as the bedside lamp wobbled from the chaos. Nicole lunged toward them, her hands grasping at Carter's arm, trying to pull him back. Her breathing was erratic, her sobs choked by fear. Her entire body trembled as she clung to him, her nails digging into his skin, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He barely registered her presence as he tightened his grip, driving Chris backward with relentless fury. Chris's foot caught on the edge of the rug, his balance slipping. His arms flailed for something to grab onto, but there was nothing. A brief flicker of panic crossed his face just before his head struck the sharp edge of the wooden nightstand. The impact sent a dull, sickening crack through the room. His body collapsed instantly, lifeless before he even hit the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carter's breath came in uneven gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. His body was rigid, his fists still clenched, but his mind had gone eerily blank. He felt detached from himself, as if he were watching the scene from outside his own body. Nicole let out a strangled sob as she dropped to her knees beside Chris. Her hands hovered over his unmoving body, hesitating before pressing against his chest, searching for breath, for life, for anything. Her fingers trembled as she touched his face, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Her body convulsed with panic, her lips forming silent, broken pleas as she stared at the crimson pool spreading beneath his head. She rocked back, her eyes darting between Carter and the motionless form on the floor. Tears streamed down her face, streaking her cheeks, her expression frozen somewhere between horror and disbelief. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her mouth, as if trying to hold back the overwhelming scream rising in her throat. Her body shook violently, her entire frame consumed by shock. Carter took a step back, his breath catching as the enormity of what he had done settled over him. The fury that had consumed him only moments ago drained away, leaving behind a crushing emptiness. His hands, the same hands that had just taken a life, trembled at his sides. His chest tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an iron grip. Chris Johnson was dead. And nothing could undo it. The silence in the room was suffocating. The only sound was Nicole's ragged sobs as she knelt beside Chris's motionless body. Her trembling hands hovered over his neck, pressing lightly against his skin, searching for a pulse that wasn't there. Her breaths came in frantic gasps, her chest heaving as she shook her head in disbelief. The color drained from her face as reality settled over her like a crushing weight. Carter stood frozen, his own breath uneven, his hands still clenched at his sides. His pulse pounded violently in his ears, drowning out everything else. His body felt detached from his mind, like he was watching the scene unfold from outside himself. The blood on the floor gleamed under the dim light, stark and final. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't come here to kill a man. His thoughts spiraled. What now? Call the police? Admit everything? Would they believe it was an accident? Would they care? He saw the headlines flashing in his mind, the way the story would be twisted, the way his children would hear about their father. A crime of passion. A jealous husband. A life taken in an instant of blind rage. His breath hitched. His children. If he called the police, they would take him away. James and Lauren would grow up visiting their father behind bars. They would hear whispers, the judgment from neighbors, the shame of what he had done. Would they even understand? Would they ever forgive him? Then there was Nicole. She was still sobbing, her fingers gripping Chris's lifeless arm as if willing him to wake up. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her entire body trembling. She had been in his arms just moments ago, lost in something Carter was never supposed to see. But now, the fear in her eyes wasn't for Chris. It was for Carter, for what was about to come next. She stayed on the floor, rocking slightly as her tears turned into gut-wrenching cries. Minutes passed, yet she remained, her sobs breaking the heavy silence of the room. Then, without warning, she pushed herself up, wiping at her tear-streaked face with shaking hands. Her gaze darted toward the door, then to Carter, then back to Chris. She let out a shuddering breath, her chest heaving, as if her body was trying to process the horror of what had just happened. Suddenly, she turned and bolted toward the living room. Carter watched, stunned, as she rushed to the children, who were still playing, oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around them so tightly that James let out a startled gasp. Lauren whimpered, frightened by the sudden intensity of her mother's embrace. Nicole held them as if they were the only things keeping her grounded, pressing frantic kisses to their heads, her breath ragged and uneven. The children squirmed in confusion, sensing something was wrong but too young to understand. She stroked their hair, gripping them so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then, without looking back, she stood, grabbing their hands. Panic flickered in her wide eyes as she pulled them toward the front door. James hesitated, glancing toward his father, his face filled with uncertainty, but Nicole yanked him forward. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the doorknob, her breaths coming in quick, sharp bursts. The door swung open, and she stepped out into the night, pulling the children with her, their small feet stumbling as they struggled to keep up with her hurried pace. She disappeared into the darkness, her sobs fading as she fled toward home. Carter stood there, his body rigid, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He listened to the fading sound of his wife's panicked retreat, the weight of his actions sinking in like a stone in his chest. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in. The air was thick, suffocating. Time was slipping through his fingers, and yet he couldn't move. He had to decide. Carter stood motionless, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like an anchor. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his fingers feeling numb as they pressed the familiar numbers. The line rang once before a calm voice answered. His own voice was steady, almost detached, as he reported what had happened. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain. There was nothing left to say. He ended the call and let the phone slip from his hand onto the nightstand. The silence in the room was suffocating, interrupted only by Nicole's quiet sobs as she clutched Chris's lifeless body. The blood on the floor was starting to dry, darkening against the wood. Carter could still hear the echo of the moment, the sickening crack, the sharp gasp, the way time had stopped the instant Chris hit the ground. The distant wail of sirens broke through the heavy stillness. The sound grew louder, piercing the night, drawing closer with every second. Carter took a slow breath, closing his eyes for a moment, knowing that his life, as he had known it, was over. When the red and blue lights flashed outside, shadows danced across the walls. A sharp knock on the front door sent a ripple of tension through the air. Nicole flinched, her hand still pressed against Chris's chest as if she could will his heart to beat again. Carter turned, walking toward the door without hesitation. The officers entered, guns drawn, voices commanding, but Carter didn't resist. He raised his hands, allowing them to grab his wrists and pull them behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked into place. He barely registered the sensation. Nicole remained on the bedroom floor, tears still running down her face as she stared at Carter in disbelief. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. The officers guided him out of the house, past the living room where the children still played, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in the next room. Outside, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights. Some looked shocked, others wary. A few exchanged glances but avoided looking at Nicole as she stepped onto the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked lost, as if trying to process the reality of what had just happened. Carter was placed in the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut beside him. Through the window, he watched as Nicole stood motionless at the top of the steps. The children would ask about him. They would wonder where their father had gone. Would she tell them the truth? Would they hate him when they were old enough to understand? Months passed. The courtroom was filled with hushed conversations and the clicking of cameras from reporters eager to capture the downfall of a man who had once been just another hard-working husband and father. Carter sat before the judge, his expression blank as the charges were read. His lawyers argued that it had been an accident, that he had lost control in a moment of overwhelming emotion. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A man blinded by jealousy, a violent outburst, a life taken. When the judge delivered the sentence, 15 years, Carter simply nodded. He had already known his fate. The prison walls closed around him, sealing off the world he had destroyed in an instant. Nicole was left to pick up the pieces. She remained in the house for a while, but the whispers never stopped. The neighbors no longer met her eyes, no longer invited her over. Tasha Johnson packed up and left, unable to stay in the place where her husband had died. One day, Nicole sent Carter a letter. He stared at the envelope for a long time, running his fingers over the paper, feeling the weight of what was inside. But he never opened it. Whatever she had to say, it no longer mattered. The past couldn't be undone.